Hello, Internet. It's time for another Wednesday serial. I'm here to talk about more Green Lantern because it's been a while, and I've read about the equivalent of 100 issues, including what we talked about last time, including Emerald Dawn, which I'm not going to talk about here because Damien and I did a really long discussion about that. That should be coming out soon. Once Damien's done really getting down with his 8-year celebration of being on YouTube. So I want to say, congrats, Damien. That's awesome. So, yeah, Green Lantern. We kind of left off at a certain point where we'd be at issue 9, where it goes, and it's kind of Guy Gardner's book for a while, which is interesting because it makes him going from being a heel to more of an interesting character, forcing him to realize that he's a jerk. And I think that's great. And what's interesting is in short order after this, Guy kind of gets pulled away from being a Green Lantern and becomes his own hero, having taken Sinestro's own yellow ring, and then becomes the warrior in short order after that. And it's just kind of, he's an interesting character around this time who's kind of doing his own thing. We get a lot in how Nort is handled, which follows through in other books and kind of the B book stuff, where the Guardians eventually describe him as being brought in because the Corps needs humor, and he represents this idea, which I feel is like a ghost, an esper of what would eventually become kind of the emotional core idea. Is just kind of interesting to see that all play through. There's a lot about the restructuring of the core, and then we get to what I think is actually kind of interesting is this arc called Mosaic, which is where John Stewart is put in charge of this Mosaic world because when things start, the bad Guardian that's dealt with earlier had pulled all these different parts of planets together, kind of like a battle world, into a world, and they call it this Mosaic world. And then John Stewart is the steward of it. And eventually this spins off into Green Lantern Mosaic, which runs for 18 issues, which I also read through. And it's more of this weird thought experiment about the idea of all these cultures bumping up against each other, how there's kind of an inevitable fight for land, even when people already have all their own land, just because there's a border and people are going to want to push or pull, not so much because of the land itself, but because of the control or the need to kind of advance, kind of like if you're not growing, you're dying. You don't want to feel like you're dying. You don't want to feel like placated or anything. There's a lot of other weird things too, where John has to push against the humans, even though he is human, because they're pushing ideals that aren't in line with what he believes, especially when it turns out there's KKK members in there. It feels maybe a little more Star Trek in some ways, but it's also all over the place and kind of ham-fisted, and it deals a lot with John Stewart when he's kind of at odds and Hal when they're fighting over a woman for a little bit. It's an interesting chunk of comics, but it ultimately doesn't add up to what it could have. The potential is so much higher than what was actualized. Yeah. We get this fun little bit where they play through a lot with Alan Scott, which becomes a bigger thing when they get to Green Lantern Quarterly, which I'll talk about a bit more later. And then they start really bringing in the new Green Lantern Corps, which is interesting. In issue 20, they have this Bodokai, I believe is how you pronounce a character, who's this like Amazon character. He's how like I imagine MRA would kind of picture Wonder Woman. Like she's big, she's angry, and she's always wanting to fight, and like this alien woman. I don't know. Just very aggressive, very kind of like she warrior, like, but taking a lot of masculine traits to do that, depending on how you view that. It's just interesting. It's interesting also to see how the gender politics and understanding of the 1980s really do kind of come through and play here, even though it's the 90s, but yeah, maybe early 90s is the way to say it. So as we continue through the Green Lantern run, it's really interesting. We get a lot of team ups. There's like the Flash. There's Green Arrow for a bit. There's talk of, the Justice League and all that. And it's funny how little they really rely on the Green Lantern Corps, but the Green Lantern Corps is also there with this kind of a ragtag bunch. There's about a dozen, with a little bit of change that happens behind the scenes that happens in other comics, which is interesting. But it's fun because Jones, and mostly MD Bright penciling, has really created the corner of Green Lantern during this time. And this was really his moment with kind of a whole corner of the DC universe. And it's funny to me because it's going and it's developing. And we get all these team ups. We have the Green Lantern Corps. That's the new Green Lantern Corps. And we don't even get a ton of time to know them. And then we get to, I'm going to say, issue 42. And there's a Deathstroke fight, which is almost like a team up in a way because Deathstroke has his own book, but they're fighting. Which is this last arc that ties in with Carol Danvers and her time as the Star Sapphire, which kind of wraps up with 43 and 44. Or no, I'm sorry. This kind of happens and it bleeds into 43 and 44. But these two issues are part of this Marvel Trinity thing that's happening with all these other cosmic books. So it's like Legion and Dark Stars. And Dark Stars is interesting because one of those Green Lantern Corps members I mentioned earlier, whose name was AA, he joins the Dark Stars. So he defects from the Green Lanterns, even though Hal brought him in, and then joins the Dark Stars. And it feels like there's this whole arc there that I didn't see any of. Because it was happening all in this other book, which is fine. It was just weird that it was just brought up haphazardly. And so Trinity continues, and then right after this Trinity team up, we go right into Reign of the Supermen, which is when Coast City is destroyed. In the middle of this giant Superman event, this major thing for Green Lantern happens. And then you have issue 47. Now, issue 47 is major because this is the last Jones Green Lantern issue. And in it, we have this play on this idea that Hal was so uncertain during the famous Green Lantern, Green Arrow run in his mind because he was zapped with this ray that affected his willpower, but he's overcome it now. And then Green Lantern calls bullshit and says, no, something's changed. Like, there's a fire in you that's different. And it's an interesting interplay between these characters. Clearly there's supposed to be more, because then we move to something else, and it's this whole plot with Pi, who's been helping Hal and Carol with their flight business. That's been a plot kind of meandering throughout this whole run. They have to go save him, and then there's something with Carol's father being behind this as well, but it turns out that's just a robot. But Carol's mom is still alive, and it just, there's so many things in this issue that are just happening after the book being relatively slow-paced and taking its time and making sure things are happening at a clip so that it's not just happening for drama's sake, but feeling like a more lived-in world compared to comics. This just feels like he had all these ideas, and so he wrapped them up as quick as he could, because then we get Ron Mars coming in, who's going to be, there's patches, but basically the main guy on the book from here on out, into Emerald Twilight, which, what a way to start the book. In these 3 issues, because of the events of Reign of Superman, Hal snaps, tries to recreate the city with his ring. There's not enough power, and then he just starts battering Green Lanterns, fighting them off, grabbing their rings, and then he goes for the Guardians to make a point, and he kind of ends up defeated and flies off. We'll see where it goes, but in the process, a lot of the Guardians die to protect the central battery from Hal, and we're off to go meet Kyle Rayner, essentially. What I found particularly interesting was in the first issue of Ron Mars, the editor note in front of the letters page says something about how, this change has been a long time coming. And Hal is a relatively boring character, and either he's kind of stoic and boring, and even like someone like Neil Adams doesn't quite know what to do with him, or he's a jerk. Like, he's too nice or he's a jerk. Like, and so they conclude he's a boring character at this point, and so they need a change. And so you never know, but what comes across is that there is this weird editorial mandate, and Jones had been doing this book for a while, and apparently they wanted to shift something. To me, it seems pretty apparent that Green Lantern was kicked up a notch and became more prominent throughout this run, and it probably started off relatively well, but at this point we're near 5 years in, and stuff might have slumped. And also we're in this weird moment of DC where they're actually taking pains to kind of look at a new generation. Superman just died and was reborn. We have the breaking of the bat, so we have Nightfall going on. Flash Barry had just died, and now we're getting a new Green Lantern. So 90s DC, and I'm going to be curious to see how it reads and goes forward. But it's really interesting to take this character that we've been following and dealing with a whole bunch of bizarre romantic subplots and whatnot, and just watch him become the villain in a snap. The bigger part I wanted to talk about, because so much of the promise of Green Lantern to me was actually held up in these books. Green Lantern Corps Quarterly. So these came out sporadically, near as I can tell. They say to be once a quarter, but the way it lines up with the books, not quite. And so, I don't know, the first one really, and really the first several, just feel like anthology. The first one, we have this really fun, totally 90s story with Jack T. Chance, who's, as you can see, just like, trench coat, grungy looking, all that. He's a guy who carries guns, and he's dealing with like the seediest part of crime in the galaxy, and so he's this rough and tumble Green Lantern that doesn't really interact with the Green Lanterns at all. So he's kind of recruited here, but not by anyone, even though Hal's the one who's supposed to be recruiting around this time. So it just feels odd. And we have an Alan Scott story and a Nort story, and most of these have an Alan Scott and Nort story, which is, the Alan Scott threads are really interesting, even though it's like giving Alan Scott a moment, but he has all these crazy stories happening in Justice League at the time. So I'm only peering at it through these books, and it's like he shows up and they're talking about the Golden Age and how the JSA has essentially reappeared. And then a couple issues later, they're talking about how he was de-aged, and now his family is finding out for the first time. And they're dealing with all that, which ends up wrapping up in this big explosive fight in the last issue of this. But I don't know if that had any effect on the Justice League books or Justice Society books going forward. So it's just this weird peer with the character, like they felt the need to do something with Alan Scott in these books, but really everything with him was going on in Justice Society, so I don't know why they needed to here. Then we get random alien stuff at times, which is fun, but ultimately I feel like the reason it's lackluster is because there's only supposed to be kind of this core amount of Green Lanterns going on through the book proper. All of them kind of have reasons to why they're not interacting with the universe at large or the characters that we know of in even minor ways. So they're all kind of tucked away, and people that are appointed Green Lanterns by the Guardians for weird reasons, and it's usually some story about heroism or a cute little idea with the ring. Like there's one that they actually do, and another move that they do is they go to the Book of Oa, because it's Green Lantern's past, present, and future, so they can just kind of tell stories from when the status quo is different. That's fine, which is great. I don't necessarily need them to all be relevant to the moment, especially because this is over a decade ago now, but it's more fun when the story's at least tangentially tied to the universe at large, as opposed to just being a little bottle episode with characters we'll never see or hear from again, because then it just feels ethereal beyond the point of interesting. One in particular is this Green Lantern who's fighting off this yellow, essentially lawnmower chasing after him. He's trying to figure out what to do, but he only has like minutes left on the battery. He's trying to come up with every which way to kind of cheat the time system, go into another time zone, quickly do something to change the hours so that he can get more more time with the battery, because it's just this arbitrary rule. And the ring's basically protesting. They're just saying, the one thing that can't happen though is that the ring can't be destroyed. He says, oh, okay. So he takes the ring and he chucks it in and it destroys the machine. It's just a fun, cute little idea, told in the story. That's a few pages. And I think that's where more of this book would have been great if it landed there. Ultimately, the last two issues are the best because we have a few Green Lanterns that just interact with other Green Lanterns. And so the stories just feel more interesting because the characters of the stories being told are present in some way. And the last one's actually interesting because it's that Jack T. Chance fighting Lobo, which is another super 90s character, right? And it's just fun to see two grungy characters go at it for the sake of it. When there's no stakes, you don't really care who wins. It's funny that a story like that actually has more stakes because you don't care who wins, because it's not like, is Spider-Man going to survive? I'm like, oh, are they going to kill Jack T. Chance? Because no reason not to. But they don't. But what's interesting is they make a big point of it in this story that he's supposed to be tied to this planet. Like, the reason the Guardians are letting him get away with so much and kind of abuse the Green Lantern power is because he's on this crime planet where things are so much seedier. But he's not allowed to go outside of the planet with the power ring. So he's limited. But then he shows up when Hal's taking all those rings and fights him for a couple panels, and Hal wins because he doesn't really use the ring, he uses his guns. So it's kind of weird to see the two stories kind of contradict each other, even though in a way it would make sense. You can totally no prize it, right? The Guardians are desperate, Hal's on a charge, and so they're calling on Jack T. Chance like, hey, we need you to beat up this guy. That's all Jack T. Chance wants to do. That's why he took the powers, to beat up people anyways. So sure, he flies off and then that happens. I mean, there you go. They could have put that in a caption though. They really could have written that in. It wouldn't have taken much. So yeah, I don't know. I was excited to just kind of share with you some of the overview and some of the cuter stuff about Green Lantern, because I thought those were more fun to talk about than the general stories for the most part. And I'm really kind of excited because in a way I feel like I read this whole era of Green Lantern already. And it's weird because if this comic was any more modern, it would have had a volume break at this point. And that's something that kind of annoys me, is like, I feel like modern comics do a lot of volumes, but they never do a good job of breaking the volumes at the right point. Like the Snyder Capullo run of Batman goes over like a couple volumes. Why? Make that one volume and then move on. Like, you have these creators and a vision, the status quo. And then when you change that, then change the volume. Make the volumes relevant to like a certain kind of reading experience, and then let the next volume be its own thing. I mean, this should have been a clear volume break, regardless, even for the time. I mean, you're kind of changing the principal creators and you're changing the principal character of the book. I can't really think of any time that's happened like a solo series where they just let that ride. I mean, yeah, even when they did Wolverine, right? Like when it changed to X-23 as Wolverine, just to differentiate it, she had her own volume, or volumes at that point, which that should have probably been one volume. Yeah, I don't know, but cheers. Hope you guys are having a good one, and talk to you soon.